Keanu Reeves was known all around the world. His face appeared on posters, movie screens, and magazine covers. Yet behind the fame, he was a quiet man who never liked too much attention. Whenever he walked into a public place, people would point, whisper, or come rushing to take photos. Sometimes they only saw the actor, not the person inside. It was tiring for him. He wanted just for once to be invisible. So one morning he woke up with a small idea. He thought, what if he could walk outside like a regular man, without the weight of cameras and flashing lights? He opened his closet and ignored the neat suits and expensive jackets. Instead, he picked an old pair of jeans, a simple dark hoodie, and a worn-out cap, the kind that would make him look like anyone else on the street. When he looked at himself in the mirror, he smiled. He barely recognized his own reflection. His eyes seemed free, like a schoolboy ready for a secret adventure. The streets were alive that day. People hurried to work, mothers pulled children along, and vendors shouted about fresh fruit and coffee. Normally, if Keanu had walked there, heads would have turned instantly. Phones would be raised to capture him. But today he blended into the rhythm of the city. Nobody noticed him, and that was exactly what he wanted. He felt a strange excitement. It was almost like playing a role. But this time it wasn't for a movie, it was for himself. The disguise was not about hiding in shame. It was about discovering how the world looked when no one was staring at him. As he walked past a bakery, the smell of warm bread reached him. He saw people laughing, chatting, and eating without a care, and he thought how different this felt. He could finally watch without being watched. Keanu wandered deeper into the city, each corner bringing him new sights. A street musician strumming a guitar, a painter spraying bright colors on a brick wall, a group of teenagers sharing jokes by a bus stop. He listened, he observed, he felt present. There was no director calling action, no assistant rushing him to the next appointment. Only life simple and unpolished, but there was also another side, one he often forgot while living in comfort. He noticed the delivery man sweating under the heavy weight of boxes, the old woman struggling with her grocery bags, the cleaner sweeping dust that people carelessly left behind. These were faces that rarely got applause, yet they kept the city moving, Keanu thought to himself. Maybe fame and fortune had created a wall around him, a wall that kept these stories far from his view. Today that wall was gone. He walked into a small cafe, nothing fancy, just a modest place with cracked chairs and the smell of cheap coffee. He ordered quietly, keeping his head down. The cashier gave him no second look. To her, he was just another tired man buying a drink. Keanu felt almost thrilled at this small victory. He sat in the corner and watched people come and go, students with books, workers with uniforms, each carrying invisible burdens, each fighting their own private battles. As he sipped the coffee, he thought back to his childhood when nobody knew his name. Back then he had walked streets like these without fear of being recognized. Life had been simpler, though not always easy. He remembered the times he had struggled for money, the odd jobs, the endless auditions, the rejection letters. Those days were not far from what he was seeing now. A city full of people trying, failing, surviving, and hoping. The disguise had given him something precious. It gave him the ability to connect. He felt almost like a ghost, moving among strangers, seeing them raw and real, without anyone altering their behavior because of his presence. He could feel their laughter, their frustration, their love, their pain. It was a classroom where every passing stranger was a teacher, and the lessons were about humility and truth. At one point, a young boy bumped into him and spilled a little juice. The boy quickly apologized. Keanu smiled gently and said, "It's okay." The boy ran off. Never realizing he had spoken to a world-famous star, Keanu laughed softly to himself. That tiny moment was sweeter than the loudest applause in a cinema. It was genuine, free of expectations, free of fame. The day went on and Keanu kept wandering. The disguise worked perfectly. No one chased him, no one interrupted him. He was invisible yet alive. He realized how rare this freedom was, to walk without labels, to breathe without judgment, to simply be. And yet, beneath the joy, he also felt a quiet sadness. He knew he would have to return to his real identity, to the world where his face was not just his own but a symbol for millions. He respected that life. He was grateful for it. But deep inside, he cherished these hours of silence, these hours of blending into the crowd. It reminded him that even though he lived a life of fame, he was still just a man among men. The disguise was simple, an old hoodie, a cap, and jeans. But the experience was powerful. It gave him back his humanity. It gave him the chance to see the world not from the red carpet but from the sidewalk, not from the stage but from the corner of a small cafe. For Keanu Reeves, that was worth more than any award. More than any headline, it was the quiet truth he longed for. Keanu walked slowly through the city streets. Still wearing his disguise, he had no schedule. No assistant following him. No fans asking for pictures. He was free. The cool air brushed against his face, and he felt like a traveler in his own city. Each step carried him deeper into the everyday lives of people who passed without noticing him. He found peace in that. As the afternoon sun began to fade, Keanu turned onto a quieter street. It was lined with small shops, laundromats, and family-owned restaurants, nothing shiny, nothing glamorous. Just places where people worked long hours to survive. One small cafe caught his eye. Its sign was faded, the windows a little dusty. Inside, he could see just a few customers finishing their meals. Something about the place pulled him closer. He opened the door and stepped inside. The cafe smelled of coffee, fried food, and cleaning soap. It wasn't the kind of place where stars were expected to go. The tables were scratched. The chairs wobbled slightly. But it was alive with the hum of real life. Keanu sat down quietly in the corner and ordered a cup of tea. He pulled his cap lower, making sure no one recognized him. He wasn't there to be noticed, he was there to see. That's when he noticed the worker, a tall black man, maybe in his 30s, dressed in a plain uniform that had faded from too many washes. His shoes were worn, his shoulders bent forward from carrying too much weight for too long. The man moved from table to table, wiping each surface with care, then sweeping the floor, then carrying a heavy trash bag outside. There was no break in his rhythm, no pause for rest. Keanu's eyes followed him quietly. He wasn't staring out of curiosity, but out of respect. There was something about the man's energy that caught his heart. His face showed tiredness, yet his hands never stopped working. There was no smile, but no bitterness either. Just a kind of quiet endurance. Keanu felt a lump in his throat. He thought about how many times he had walked into cafes where workers like this went unseen. People ordered food, ate, and left, never thinking about the man who cleaned the table or washed the dishes afterward. The worker walked past Keanu's table, carrying a tray of dirty cups. Keanu lowered his head slightly. He didn't want to draw attention, but up close he saw the lines on the man's face, the roughness of his hands, the small scar near his chin. These were marks of a life filled with effort and struggle. He wasn't just a worker. He was a story, one that the world rarely cared to hear. For a while, Keanu simply sipped his tea and watched. Outside the window, people walked quickly, rushing to their homes, but inside the cafe, time seemed slower. The workers' movements filled the room, every task done with a kind of resigned discipline. He mopped the floor, stacked the chairs, and cleaned the counter. Even though the cafe had only a few customers left, it looked like he was preparing for another endless shift. Keanu wondered what kind of life the man lived. Did he have a family waiting for him at home, or did he return to a small room after hours of work? Was he paid fairly for all this effort, or was he barely surviving? Keanu's heart grew heavy as he thought of the difference between his own life and this man's. Fame had given him wealth and comfort, but it had also distanced him from these struggles. He felt humbled to be sitting there disguised, able to witness a reality that was raw and unfiltered. The cafe grew quieter as the last customer left. The owner gave a short wave and walked out, leaving the worker behind. Keanu noticed how the man's shoulders slumped even lower once the door closed, like he had been carrying a mask of strength for others, and now he was alone with his exhaustion. He leaned on the mop for a second, breathing heavily. Before forcing himself to keep going, Keanu thought about his own hardships from the past, the losses he had suffered, the battles with grief, and the struggles of being young and poor. He had known pain, but seeing this man reminded him that pain wasn't something he had left behind. It lived in every corner of the city, in the lives of people who worked without reward, unseen by the world. At that moment, Keanu didn't feel like a movie star. He felt like just another human being, sitting quietly and learning from another person's silent story. He wanted to stand up, to speak, to ask if the man was okay, but something stopped him. Maybe it was respect. Maybe it was fear of breaking the invisible wall between them. Instead, he decided to keep watching, to let the moment unfold naturally. The sound of the mop against the floor echoed in the empty cafe. The worker hummed softly, a tune with no words, maybe a way to keep himself company. It was simple but beautiful. Keanu closed his eyes for a moment and let the sound wash over him. It was not music for an audience. It was music for survival. When he opened his eyes again, he saw the worker pause, pat his pocket, and shake his head slowly. Keanu couldn't hear the words, but he saw the lips move in a whisper. The man muttered something about money, something about not being paid again. Keanu's heart sank. Here was a man giving so much effort, pouring his body into every corner of this cafe, and yet his pockets remained empty. Keanu sat still, his tea untouched now. The disguise had allowed him to step into another world, and what he saw broke him a little inside. This was not a movie scene, not a performance. It was life, hard and unfair, and he was a witness to it. Keanu sat in the corner of the cafe, his tea turning cold, but his attention fixed on the worker who moved through the room with quiet determination. There was no audience, no applause. Yet the man worked as if every task mattered deeply. His hands scrubbed the tables until they shone. His feet dragged slightly from exhaustion, but he refused to stop. Keanu leaned back in his chair, his cap pulled low, and watched carefully. He was not staring out of rudeness, but from a place of respect and sadness. Every small detail of the worker's movements told a story. The way he rolled his shoulders to ease the stiffness, the way he sighed softly when he thought no one was listening, the way his eyes darted to the door as if waiting for something that never came. The cafe was nearly empty now. Only a faint sound of traffic came from outside. Inside, the worker's body spoke louder than words. Keanu noticed how tired he looked, but there was still a rhythm in his actions, as if he had trained himself to keep going no matter what. His back bent slightly, his arms strong but weary. He pushed the mop across the floor with long, steady strokes, pausing only to wipe the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. Keanu felt his heart tighten. Here was a man who seemed to carry the weight of the world, yet no one saw him. Customers had come and gone earlier without a second glance. Even the owner had left, leaving the worker alone to finish everything. Keanu thought about how often people like him, actors, celebrities, were celebrated for pretending to be heroes on screen, while real-life heroes worked in silence, unseen and unpaid. The worker sat down for a moment at the edge of a chair, stretching his arms and cracking his knuckles. Keanu watched the small gesture closely. It was the kind of thing people did only when they were truly exhausted. But after less than a minute, the man stood again and forced himself back to work. Keanu could almost feel the man's thoughts. He seemed to be saying to himself, "There's no time to rest if I don't do it. No one else will." The more Keanu observed, the more he realized that the worker's struggle wasn't only physical, it was emotional too. Every sigh carried years of hardship. Every tired glance toward the ceiling held questions about life, about survival, about dignity. Keanu remembered times in his own past when he had felt invisible, when he had been broke and waiting for opportunities that never came, and for the first time in years he felt that same ache through someone else's body language. The worker picked up a stack of plates from a table and carried them to the back. His steps heavy but careful when he returned. He grabbed a cloth and wiped the counter, moving slowly, as though each swipe of the cloth took energy he barely had left. Keanu noticed the small tremble in his hand, the tired blink of his eyes, the way he forced himself to keep standing even when his legs seemed to beg for rest. At one point, the worker stopped and looked at his reflection in the cafe's window. His shoulders slumped and he stood very still. Keanu watched as the man straightened his posture slightly, almost as if giving himself courage to continue. It was such a small, subtle moment, but it struck Keanu deeply. Here was a man fighting an invisible battle every second, a battle against exhaustion, against hopelessness, against being forgotten. Keanu thought of how different their worlds were. He lived in a place where people recognized him everywhere, where money flowed from one movie contract to another. Yet this man, who worked harder in one evening than most did in a week, was barely surviving. He was strong, yet powerless in the system that ignored him. It was a truth too many preferred not to see, but Keanu could not look away. The worker continued his routine, pushing tables into place, sweeping crumbs into a dustpan, stacking cups, all with the kind of patience that only comes from necessity. Keanu admired him. Even in struggle there was dignity, a quiet kind of pride in doing the job right. But that pride was mixed with pain, and it broke Keanu's heart to watch as the minutes passed. Keanu found himself breathing slower, almost in rhythm with the worker's movements. He felt like he was part of the man's struggle. Connected through silence, the cafe had become a stage. But this was no movie. There was no script, no ending written for comfort. It was real life unfolding in front of him, raw and unedited. The worker finally leaned on his mop again. His head bowed. Keanu could not hear his words, but he saw the lips moving, perhaps whispering a prayer, perhaps speaking to himself. His eyes looked tired but not defeated. He seemed like a man who had learned how to endure without hope of reward. Keanu swallowed hard, realizing how rare it was to witness such truth. He wanted to help, but he stayed still, Because this moment was not about him. It was about the worker's story, about the unspoken message carried in every tired step, every bent shoulder, every sigh. Keanu realized that sometimes the most powerful truths are revealed not in words but in the quiet language of the body. As the night deepened, Keanu's disguise felt less like a mask and more like a key. It had unlocked a view of life he rarely saw, a life where dignity and pain walked side by side. He continued to observe in silence, every small detail carving itself into his memory. He knew he would never forget this worker, not the way his body told a story of struggle and survival, not the way he stood tall despite being unseen. The cafe was now almost silent. Only the faint hum of a refrigerator filled the air. Keanu stayed in his corner seat, his hands wrapped loosely around the warm cup that he had long stopped drinking from. His eyes followed the worker as he finished the last of his tasks. There was no one else left in the cafe. No customers, no owner, just the two of them breathing in the same quiet space. The worker set his mop aside and pulled out a chair. He lowered himself slowly, like every muscle in his body was begging for relief. Keanu noticed the way he exhaled long and heavy, the kind of sigh that carried years of tiredness. He rubbed his forehead, his eyes half closed, and for the first time that evening he allowed himself to show how exhausted he truly was. After a moment, the man reached into his pocket. He pulled out his wallet and opened it. Keanu leaned slightly forward, not to invade his privacy, but because something about the man's movements felt heavy. The worker flipped through the wallet, but there was almost nothing inside. Only a few worn receipts and a single bus ticket. He shook his head slowly, whispering under his breath. Keanu couldn't hear every word, but he caught enough to understand. "No money again," the worker muttered softly. His voice cracked as though he had repeated the same sentence too many times. "Another day, no pay." He tapped the wallet against the table, his eyes staring down as if the leather itself had betrayed him. Keanu felt his chest tighten. He understood in that moment that the man wasn't just tired from work. He was tired from being cheated, from giving his energy to a job that gave him nothing back. The cafe owner had walked out earlier with ease, leaving the worker behind to finish everything. And now Keanu realized the owner had also left without paying him. It wasn't just a long day, it was a long chain of days like this. The worker rubbed his face with both hands as if trying to wipe away the frustration. Then he leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. He looked not only exhausted but broken in a quiet way, the kind of brokenness that didn't show with loud anger but with silence. Keanu could see in his eyes the weight of unpaid bills, hungry nights, and the endless cycle of being powerless. For a moment, the worker pulled out his phone, an old cracked screen that lit up weakly. He scrolled for a second and then sighed again. He whispered something about his children, his rent, his struggles. The words were half prayers, half confessions. Keanu's heart sank even lower. He wished he could close the distance, tell the man that someone saw him, someone cared, but instead he stayed still. Hidden in his disguise, Keanu thought about how strange life was. Here he was, a man with millions, sitting only a few feet away from another man who had nothing. Their lives separated by chance, by fate, by the unfair design of the world. It made Keanu feel small, helpless even. Fame and wealth suddenly seemed like illusions, because what good were they if men like this worker continued to suffer unseen? The worker stood again, forcing himself back to his tasks, even with no money in his pocket. Even after admitting his pain out loud, he kept cleaning. He picked up the trash bag, tied it carefully, and carried it outside when he returned. He washed his hands and picked up the broom again. Keanu almost wanted to shout, "Stop, you deserve better. You shouldn't give so much when they give you nothing." But he remained quiet. Only his heart screamed inside. Keanu noticed the small details that revealed the man's inner struggle. The way his shoulders dropped lower with every trip to the back. The way he pressed his lips tight when he thought of his situation. The way he forced himself to keep moving because he knew if he stopped, everything might collapse. This was more than physical labor. It was survival. Minutes passed slowly, and Keanu sat frozen in his chair, his tea untouched. He realized that the disguise he wore had given him access to the truth, the kind of truth he would have missed if he had walked in as himself, as a celebrity, because then the cafe owner might have treated the worker differently, maybe even pretended everything was fine. But in this disguise, Keanu saw the reality with no filters. The worker finished sweeping and leaned against the counter, his head bowed, his lips moving again. Keanu caught the words this time. "God, just one break. Just one chance." It wasn't a loud prayer. It was a whisper spoken into the empty cafe. Not expecting an answer, Keanu's throat tightened. He wanted to step forward, reveal himself, promise to help, but he held back. Because this wasn't about being a hero. It was about listening, about truly seeing. The night outside grew darker. The worker turned off some of the lights, leaving only a dim glow in the cafe. Keanu realized it was time to leave soon, but he couldn't shake the heaviness he felt. He had come out in disguise hoping to experience normal life, but what he had found was something far more important. He had found a truth that cut deeper than anything fame could ever show him. When the worker picked up his coat, Keanu saw the way he hesitated, as if wondering how he would get home, whether he had enough for the bus, whether he would eat tonight. It was the kind of hesitation that told a story louder than words. Keanu knew then that the man's struggle wasn't just about this one night. It was about every night, every shift, every day of unpaid labor and unseen suffering. Keanu sat quietly for a few more minutes, watching the man prepare to leave. He felt both powerless and determined. Powerless because he couldn't erase the man's pain with one gesture. Determined because he knew this moment would stay with him forever. It would remind him to never turn away from the struggles of others, no matter how invisible they seemed. Keanu stayed seated in the corner, his body still, his mind racing. He had just watched the worker reveal his truth. A truth spoken not through loud words but through whispers. Sighs and heavy shoulders. Keanu felt something deep inside him break. He had seen poverty before. He had known pain in his own life, but watching it unfold so closely, so quietly was different. It wasn't a movie scene, it wasn't a script. It was raw life happening right in front of him. The worker moved around the cafe, finishing the last tasks with tired hands. Every motion seemed heavier now, like the weight of his empty wallet pressed down on every step. Keanu's eyes followed him and he felt helpless. He wanted to stand up and say something. Anything, but the words never came. Instead, he sat in silence, his heart aching with every glance. There was something deeply painful about seeing strength mixed with suffering. The worker was strong. His body proved it. His discipline proved it, yet strength alone wasn't enough. He was giving everything and receiving nothing. Keanu thought about how unfair the world could be, how it celebrated wealth and fame, while ignoring the silent warriors who held society together. His chest tightened as he realized how often these people went unseen. The silence in the cafe made the sadness even louder. Each sound, the broom brushing the floor, the chair legs scraping as the worker moved them, echoed like a reminder of loneliness. There was no one cheering him, no one thanking him, no one saying good job. Keanu wondered how long a man could keep going like this. How long before the heart gave up? Even if the body kept moving. Keanu thought of his own past losses, the deaths of loved ones, the nights when grief had made the world feel empty. Those memories gave him a way to understand the worker's quiet suffering. Pain didn't always need tears or screams. Sometimes it lived in silence, hidden behind tired eyes and forced movements. Keanu recognized that silence because he had carried it once too. He remembered how people often assumed that pain had to be loud to be real, but here was proof that the most heartbreaking pain was silent. The worker didn't shout about not being paid. He didn't throw his mop or slam the door, he just kept working, whispering his frustration only to himself. That quiet endurance hit Keanu harder than any scream could have. The worker finally leaned against the counter, his head resting in his hands for a moment. His lips moved again, another soft prayer or perhaps just a confession to the empty room. Keanu strained to hear but caught only fragments. Words like tired, children, and someday. It was enough to paint the picture. Keanu closed his eyes and felt a sting behind them. A wave of sadness rising inside. He wanted to go over and speak. To tell the man he wasn't invisible. To tell him he deserved better, but Keanu stayed quiet. Maybe it was fear of breaking the fragile moment. Maybe it was the understanding that sometimes silence was the greatest form of respect. So he sat still, letting the heartbreak wash over him. Minutes stretched on. The worker kept moving with slow determination. Keanu's heart grew heavier with every glance. He realized that this moment was teaching him more about life than years of fame had ever done. He thought about how people adored him for playing heroes on screen. But this man was the true hero, working tirelessly, carrying his struggles without recognition. Keanu's silence became a mirror. In it, he saw not only the worker's heartbreak, but his own. Two different lives, two different worlds, yet connected by the same thread of human pain. The actor and the worker, both living with silent battles, both carrying scars the world could not see. The heartbreak Keanu felt was not just for the man in front of him. It was for everyone like him, every unseen worker, every unpaid hand, every soul whispering into the night for a break that never came. He realized that the city was full of these stories, silent tragedies playing out in the shadows, ignored by the noise of everyday life. The worker wiped the last table and placed the cloth back on the counter. He stood still for a moment, staring at the empty chairs as if they were ghosts. Keanu watched him closely. He saw the tired curve of his back, the way his eyes held no light, the way his fingers tapped nervously against his side. Keanu felt a deep sorrow, the kind that doesn't fade quickly, the kind that stays in the soul. The silence between them was almost unbearable, but it was also sacred. Keanu knew that if he spoke, the moment would change, the raw truth might slip away, so he let the silence hold them both, his own heart breaking quietly in the shadows of the cafe. When the worker finally put on his coat and prepared to leave, Keanu remained in his seat, his hands trembling slightly. He had never felt so powerless, never felt so deeply the unfairness of the world. Yet at the same time, he had never felt so connected to another human being. As the worker stepped out into the cold night, Keanu stayed behind for a while, staring at the empty cafe. The silence pressed against him like a weight. He breathed deeply and let the heartbreak sink into him. He knew he would never forget this night, never forget the man whose struggle had spoken louder than any applause. Keanu remained seated even after the worker left the cafe. The sound of the door closing behind the man seemed to echo in the silence. He looked around at the empty room, the chairs stacked, the counters wiped clean, the faint smell of coffee still lingering in the air. Everything looked finished. But inside Keanu's heart, nothing felt complete. He couldn't just walk away, not after what he had seen. He thought about the worker's tired face, the way he had whispered about money, the way his body had carried both strength and exhaustion. Keanu's mind replayed every detail. It was like a film running on loop. Only this wasn't fiction. It was real life, and it left him restless. He had seen too much truth to leave without doing something. Even if it was small, Keanu reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against his wallet. He hesitated for a moment. It felt strange. Here he was, a man with more money than he could ever need. And yet the worker, who had given every ounce of energy to his job, had left with nothing. The unfairness burned inside him. He opened the wallet slowly and looked at the bills. For him, they were just paper. For the worker, they could mean survival. He pulled out a folded note. Not the smallest, but not too large either. He didn't want it to feel like charity. He wanted it to feel like kindness, like a quiet blessing, something that might remind the worker that the world had not completely forgotten him. Keanu looked around the cafe, wondering where to place it. He didn't want the man to know it came from him. It had to feel natural, almost like fate. His eyes landed on the mop bucket in the corner, still half filled with cloudy water. The worker would surely return for it when he came back to close the place completely. Keanu stood slowly, careful not to make noise. He walked across the room, his steps soft against the freshly cleaned floor, and slipped the folded bill under the bucket's rim where it would not be seen right away, but would eventually be found. For a second he stood there, looking at the hidden gesture, his heart beating a little faster. It wasn't much, not compared to what the worker truly deserved, but it was something, a quiet sign of recognition, a whisper back to the whispers the man had spoken earlier. Keanu returned to his seat and exhaled, a small relief washing over him. He thought about revealing himself, about stepping outside and handing the money to the man directly, telling him, "I see you. I value you." But something inside told him this wasn't about Keanu Reeves, the actor. It wasn't about a star saving a stranger. It was about humanity, about kindness given without expectation, about letting the worker feel like life itself had offered him a hand. Not a famous face, Keanu sat for a few minutes longer, listening to the quiet cafe, thinking about how sometimes the smallest gestures could mean the most. He knew this wasn't going to change the man's life completely. It wouldn't solve all his problems, but maybe it would give him a little hope. Maybe it would put food on the table for one night. Maybe it would make him believe that unseen eyes were watching with compassion. When Keanu finally stood up to leave, he walked to the door slowly, his disguise still in place. The night air outside was cold and sharp. He pulled his hoodie tighter around him and stepped into the dark street. He wondered where the worker had gone, maybe to catch the last bus, maybe to walk home in the cold, maybe to face another night of worry. Keanu wished he could follow and help more, but he knew the power of the moment lay in its quietness. As he walked away, he imagined the scene that would happen later. The worker returning to gather his mop and bucket, reaching down and finding the folded bill. Keanu pictured the surprise on his face, Maybe a smile, maybe a tear. Maybe just a long breath of relief. He hoped that in that small moment the man would feel seen, that he would know someone cared enough to leave a piece of kindness behind. The streets around Keanu were filled with strangers rushing home, but he felt a calmness inside, a calmness born from giving without recognition. It reminded him of something his mother once told him, that true kindness is done in silence, without needing thanks, without needing to be known. Tonight he understood those words more deeply than ever before. Keanu thought about the worker's quiet strength, about how many others lived the same story. He knew he couldn't help everyone, but maybe he could start by helping one, and sometimes one was enough. He realized the quiet gesture wasn't only for the worker, it was for himself too. It reminded him of who he wanted to be, not just an actor on screen, but a man who saw, who cared, who acted. The night stretched ahead. The city lights glowing in the distance, Keanu walked slowly, his disguise no longer feeling like just a mask. It had become a gift, a way to connect with real life, a way to be part of moments that fame would have stolen from him. He whispered softly to himself, "Thank you," not to anyone in particular, but to the universe for giving him this chance to witness and to give. Behind him in the quiet cafe, the folded bill waited, a small promise hidden under a mop bucket, waiting to be discovered, waiting to bring a spark of hope to a man who had given so much and received so little. Keanu didn't need to be there to see it. He carried the image in his heart. And that was enough. Keanu walked away from the cafe, the cold night air brushing against his face. The streets were quieter now, but inside his mind there was no silence. His thoughts kept circling back to the worker he had just seen. Every detail of the man's struggle replayed itself. The tired eyes, the bent shoulders, the whisper about not being paid. Keanu felt like he had been given a glimpse into a hidden world, a world of pain and strength that most people passed by without noticing. As he walked, he kept asking himself the same question. Why was life so unfair? Why did some people like him receive wealth and comfort almost beyond measure, while others gave everything and still went home with nothing? He knew the answer was not simple. The world had always been built on layers of inequality, but seeing it so closely made the truth harder to swallow. Keanu thought about his own journey. He remembered the times in his youth when he struggled to pay rent, when he went hungry, when rejection after rejection made him doubt if he would ever succeed. Those years had been hard, but even then he had small chances, small openings that eventually led him forward. The worker he had just seen didn't seem to have any doors opening for him. He was trapped in an endless cycle of giving without receiving. The image of the man's empty wallet haunted Keanu. It wasn't just leather and paper, it was a symbol of injustice, of hours of sweat exchanged for nothing, of promises broken by those in power. Keanu clenched his hands in his pockets, thinking of how easily society ignored these stories. People celebrated stars and billionaires, but rarely paused to think about the invisible ones keeping the world alive with their labor. He passed a group of young people laughing outside a brightly lit restaurant. Their table was filled with food, their voices loud with joy, and Keanu thought again about the worker who might not even have enough for a proper meal tonight. The contrast struck him like a blow, two worlds existing side by side, one drenched in comfort, the other drowning in silent struggle, and yet they barely touched each other. The injustice of it made Keanu's heart heavy. He wanted to shout it out, to tell the world to look, to open their eyes. But he knew most people didn't want to see. People turned away from pain because it made them uncomfortable. They pretended the system was fair, because it was easier than admitting it was broken. Keanu thought of his own fame, how often people called him lucky, blessed, or special. But standing in the quiet street, he didn't feel special. He felt guilty. Guilty that his success had come in a world where so many were denied even the basics. Guilty that he could buy anything he wanted while others prayed for rent money. Guilty that he could walk away from the cafe while the worker had to return to it again tomorrow. He slowed his steps and looked at the city lights glowing above the rooftops. The tall buildings glittered like towers of wealth, but beneath them lay countless stories like the one he had just witnessed. Keanu realized that for every shining light, there was a shadow. For every rich man, there were dozens struggling unseen. The injustice was not only about money, it was about dignity, about respect. The worker had given his best. He had kept the cafe clean. He had served faithfully, and yet he was treated as if his time and his body meant nothing. That was the cruelty that cut deepest. Not just the lack of pay, but the lack of recognition. Keanu remembered the worker's small prayer. Just one break, the words still echoed in his ears. It was not greed. It was not a demand for luxury. It was a plea for survival, for fairness, for a chance to breathe. And that simplicity broke Keanu's heart even more. He realized that injustice often wasn't about people asking for too much. It was about them asking for the very minimum and still being denied. He walked on, his mind filled with promises to himself. He thought about how he could use his fame differently, not just to entertain but to draw attention to stories like this. Maybe he couldn't fix the entire world, but he could speak. He could act. He could remind others to see what he had seen, to care when it was easier not to. The night was cold, but inside Keanu there was a fire lit by the image of a man cleaning tables for free, a man whispering his pain to an empty room. Keanu knew that fire would not go out. It would stay with him as a reminder. As a call to be better, he reached a corner and stopped. Looking back in the direction of the cafe, he couldn't see it anymore, but in his heart the picture remained. A man bent over a mop, a man with an empty wallet, a man whose strength deserved more than silence. Keanu whispered softly to himself, "I won't forget you." And he meant it. The reflection of injustice that night wasn't just about one worker. It was about the truth of the world, a truth most people avoided. But Keanu had walked into it by chance, and now it was carved into his memory. He knew he would carry it forward, not as guilt but as a responsibility to remember, to speak, to act, to care. The night had passed and the city was beginning to wake up again. Cars rolled slowly down the streets, and the faint glow of morning touched the rooftops. Somewhere inside the small cafe, the worker returned for another shift. He walked in quietly, carrying the same tired shoulders and the same heavy thoughts. He reached for his mop bucket, ready to begin the cycle once more. As he lifted the handle, something caught his eye. He bent down and noticed a folded piece of paper tucked carefully beneath the rim. At first he thought it was trash, maybe something left behind. But when he picked it up and opened it, his eyes widened. Inside was money, enough to buy food, enough to cover a bill, enough to ease at least one of the burdens pressing down on his chest. He looked around quickly as if expecting someone to appear, but the cafe was empty. No one had been there when he walked in. His lips trembled and he whispered softly, "Thank you," though he had no idea who to thank. He slipped the bill into his pocket, his hands shaking, his heart lighter than it had been in weeks. For the first time in a long time, he smiled, not because his problems were gone, but because kindness had found him. That small gesture, hidden under a mop bucket, became more than just money. It became a sign, a reminder that the world could still surprise him, that someone out there saw him. Even if he felt invisible, he carried that feeling with him through the day, and though the work was just as heavy, it no longer felt completely hopeless far away. Keanu thought about the man too. He didn't see his reaction, but he didn't need to. He carried the moment in his own heart. The night in the cafe had carved something permanent inside him. He knew he would never look at life the same way again. Every time he saw a worker cleaning floors, or carrying trays or serving quietly in the background, he would remember the man's face, the man's struggle, and the silence of that cafe. For Keanu, the impact was not about money. It was about perspective. He had walked into the night wearing a disguise, but he had walked out wearing a truth. The truth that kindness mattered, the truth that injustice existed everywhere, and the truth that silence sometimes spoke louder than words. He had seen a man's heart break, and it had broken something inside him too. But in that breaking, it had built something new. In the days that followed, Keanu found himself reflecting more often, on movie sets, in interviews, during long drives home. His mind would return to the cafe. He thought about how much attention the world gave to him, and how little it gave to people like the worker. He realized that fame could be used not only for entertainment but for empathy, for shining light on the unseen. He did not tell anyone about the night. He kept it as a private memory, a sacred story between him, the worker, and the silence of that cafe, but its impact guided him. It reminded him to stay humble, to stay connected, to never let wealth blind him to the struggles of others. The worker, too, carried the impact. He never learned who had left the money. He only knew that in a moment of despair, kindness had reached him, and that knowledge gave him courage. It told him he was not forgotten. It whispered to him that maybe, just maybe, life could still surprise him with goodness, and though his struggles continued, that single act gave him the strength to keep moving, to keep believing. Sometimes the smallest gestures leave the largest marks. Sometimes a folded bill under a mop bucket can carry more power than grand speeches or promises. Because it speaks directly to the heart, the worker would never know it was Keanu Reeves who had seen him. and Keanu would never see the smile that appeared when the money was found. But both men were changed, connected by a moment of unseen grace. As weeks passed, Keanu returned to his normal life, but the memory never faded. He carried it like a quiet compass, guiding him toward more compassion, more humility, more awareness. He knew he could never fix the world, but he could always choose to see, to care, to act in small ways. And that in the end was enough. The worker kept showing up at the cafe, his routine the same. His body still tired, but deep inside, he carried a secret warmth, the knowledge that kindness could arrive when least expected. It was a light in his darkness, a memory he returned to whenever the days felt too heavy. It was proof that even when he felt invisible, the universe had found a way to let him know he mattered. And so two men walked separate paths, one known by millions, one seen by almost no one. Yet their lives touched for a brief moment, and that moment lived on. It lived in the worker's renewed strength. It lived in Keanu's reflection. It lived in the silence of a small cafe where heartbreak had been met with quiet kindness. In the end, the impact was lasting, not because it changed the world in a dramatic way, but because it changed two hearts forever. One found hope, the other found purpose, and both discovered the silent truth that kindness, no matter how small, never disappears. It lingers, it grows, and it shapes the lives it touches.